1944. The chill of an early autumn morning settled over the rolling plains of rural America. Beyond the barbed wire fences, rows of German prisoners stirred awake. Men who had once marched under Hitler's banners, now far from home, their fates tied to a nation they'd been taught to despise. The war still raged across oceans, but here, in a small American POW camp, the battle was no longer fought with rifles. It was fought with dignity, pride, and food. The aroma of something unfamiliar drifted through the camp kitchen. Thick, savory, almost sweet. A line formed outside the mess hall as U.S. guards ladled portions into dented metal trays. It was army stew, a blend of vegetables, beef, and spices simmered together in massive steel pots. Hearty, practical, and unapologetically American. The German prisoners eyed it skeptically. A few laughed. One muttered, "We'd never serve this to our officers." Their smirks rippled through the line, mocking, dismissive. To them, this meal looked crude, peasant-like. The kind of food you feed to laborers, not soldiers. But hunger has a way of humbling even the proudest men. Moments later, spoons clattered, eyes widened, silence spread, the laughter faded, replaced by something unexpected: appreciation. What began as mockery turned into quiet respect, and then, to the guards' surprise, a request for seconds. The mornings inside the camp always began the same way, quiet, grey, and heavy with the kind of silence that followed defeat. Rows of barracks lined the perimeter like tired soldiers themselves, wooden frames bleached by the sun and wind. Beyond the wire, the landscape of rural America stretched endlessly. Flat fields, patches of wild grass, the distant hum of a truck engine, a faraway dog barking. But inside those fences, it might as well have been another world. Men who once wore iron crosses now lived under the cautious eyes of American guards. Their boots were worn, their uniforms faded, but their pride, still intact, was the last thing they refused to surrender. It was early autumn of 1944, and the air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant fires. The war was still raging across Europe, but here, in this patch of American farmland turned into a prisoner of war camp, battles were no longer fought with weapons. They were fought in the mind, in the daily rituals of survival and dignity. Every routine, standing in formation, shaving in cold water, eating meals at exact hours, was an act of resistance against humiliation. For these men, discipline was all that remained of their former identity. When the mess bell clanged, it echoed like a command from another life. The prisoners shuffled into line, their breath rising in white clouds. They spoke quietly in German, their voices edged with impatience. The Americans, always punctual, had prepared breakfast, or what passed for it. Coffee that wasn't coffee, bread that was more air than dough, and a pot of something new simmering in the kitchen. The aroma drifted out, thick and unfamiliar, savory, heavy with spice, and almost sweet. Some prisoners sniffed the air, frowning. "Was ist das?" one asked, wrinkling his nose. "Amerikanisches up." Another replied with a smirk. "Probably canned beans again." But this was different. The cooks, U.S. Army men used to feeding hundreds on a tight budget, had thrown together what they called army stew. A blend of potatoes, beef, onions, carrots, and whatever spices they could find. It was meant to fill the stomach, not impress the tongue. A practical meal for practical soldiers. When the trays were placed on the counter, the Germans stepped forward one by one, eyes narrowing. Each man received a ladleful of thick brown stew that plopped into his metal bowl with a dull sound. Steam rose in lazy curls. To the prisoners, it looked like something scraped from the bottom of a field kitchen, a shapeless mix of meat and mush. They exchanged glances, smirking, shaking their heads. "This," said one, lifting his bowl with disgust, "we would never serve to our officers." The man next to him chuckled. "Or even the horses." Laughter rippled through the line, low, bitter, and mocking. It was the laughter of men trying to remind themselves they were still superior, even while wearing rags and living behind wire. To them, this stew symbolized everything they believed about the Americans' crude, unrefined, lacking taste or tradition. They prided themselves on their field rations, meticulously portioned, neatly labeled, prepared according to military efficiency. Even in ruins, they held on to that image. Inside the kitchen, the American cooks heard the comments. They said nothing. These weren't the first prisoners to sneer at the food, and they wouldn't be the last. Most of the cooks were soldiers themselves, men who had eaten that same stew in freezing trenches and scorching deserts. They knew what it was, survival in a pot, a quiet defiance of hunger and fatigue, so they kept ladling, serving each man the same portion without a word, without judgment. At the tables, the Germans sat, some poking at the stew with their spoons, others laughing as they mimicked tasting it and gagging dramatically. The noise grew, mockery echoing through the mess hall. One prisoner raised his spoon like a conductor's baton and began to hum a tune, the others joining in, their laughter turning the air thick with derision. For a few minutes they forgot where they were. They forgot the fences, the guards, the war they had lost. In that moment, their pride was alive again. But beneath the laughter was something else, a tension, a fragility. The truth was that many of them hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks before capture. The rations they'd received from the collapsing German supply lines were cold, scarce, and barely enough to keep them standing. Their pride might have survived, but their bodies were failing. Hunger has a way of softening the edges of arrogance. The guards watched from the doorway, expressionless. They'd seen this before. It was almost routine now. The mocking, the pride, the pretending. They didn't take offense. Some even understood. A few of these guards had fought in North Africa and Europe. They'd seen the German army at its height, precise, unstoppable, terrifying in its order. To see those same men now, thin, unshaven, sitting in rows eating U.S. stew with shaking hands, was a strange kind of justice. But there was no hatred. Not here. The Americans fed them, clothed them, and followed the Geneva Convention to the letter. Not out of pity, but out of principle. As the Germans laughed, one cook wiped his hands on his apron and looked out at them. His name was Sergeant Roy Peterson. He was from Kansas, a farm boy who knew something about feeding large groups of hungry people. He leaned against the counter and said quietly to the corporal beside him, "Let them laugh. They'll eat it. They always do." Outside, the wind pushed against the mess hall walls, making them creak. A guard's whistle blew in the distance. The day was moving on like every other day in captivity, measured by bells, rations, and silence. The laughter inside faded slowly, replaced by the metallic clatter of spoons against bowls. A few men had decided to try the stew after all. They were still sneering, of course, still performing for one another, but hunger was a stronger motivator than pride. One young soldier, barely 20, took his first bite. He expected the taste of sludge, but what hit his tongue surprised him. The broth was rich, smoky, with bits of tender beef that melted in his mouth. He blinked, hiding his reaction, but his body betrayed him. He took another spoonful, faster this time. The others noticed. "Good, is it?" Someone teased. He shrugged. "It's edible." But it wasn't just edible. It was comforting. It reminded him, faintly, of home. The way his mother's kitchen smelled in winter, the stew she'd made on Sundays. It wasn't the same, but it was close enough to make his chest ache. Soon the others began tasting too, one after another, their expressions shifting from mockery to reluctant silence. Within minutes, the room changed. The laughter stopped. The clang of spoons against metal filled the air again, this time rhythmic, steady, almost reverent. The same men who had mocked the meal were now eating with quiet focus, their bowls emptying faster than they'd ever admit. Across the room, Sergeant Peterson saw it happen. He smiled faintly. He'd seen it before, The exact moment when pride gave way to hunger, when enemies stopped being soldiers and became just men again. He turned back to his pots, stirring slowly, letting the stew thicken. The Germans wouldn't speak of it openly. Not that day, not for weeks. But among themselves, in whispers during the night, they'd admit it. The Americans' food wasn't bad. It was, in fact, far better than what their own army had given them near the war's end. And though they wouldn't say it out loud, some even respected the cooks for it. That morning, Mockery had been their last defense. The stew had quietly disarmed it. The first bite came almost by accident. A spoon lifted hesitantly, steam curling around the prisoner's face, the smell of beef and onions clinging to the air between him and the bowl. He hadn't wanted to eat it. None of them did. But the gnawing ache in his stomach had grown louder than his pride. The stew was thick, dark, unfamiliar. It didn't look like food a soldier should eat. It looked like something you scraped together at the end of the week, when nothing was left in the pantry but bones and scraps. And yet, as he let the liquid touch his tongue, something changed. It wasn't bad. In fact, it was good. Really good. The warmth spread through his chest and down to his hands, the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in months. His eyes flickered upward, instinctively scanning the faces around him to see if anyone had noticed. They had. The men sitting nearby were watching, waiting for a reaction, ready to laugh again if he spat it out. But he didn't. He took another spoonful, slower this time, savoring it, and then another. No one said a word. For a few long seconds, the only sounds were spoons clinking against metal and the low murmur of guards outside. Then, curiosity began to ripple through the ranks. One prisoner muttered, "Na, will it is nicht so schlimm. Maybe it's not that bad." Another scoffed, rolled his eyes, and took a bite of his own. Soon others followed, each pretending to do it ironically, like a joke they weren't really committed to. But their faces betrayed them. The stew had depth, real flavor. The beef was tender, the carrots sweet, the broth smoky with just the right amount of salt. They didn't know it, but the Americans had thrown everything they had into that pot. The cooks, most of them farm boys and mechanics before the war, knew how to make do with little. They'd taken leftover meat rations, bits of vegetables, and condensed tomato paste to stretch it all further. The result wasn't elegant, but it was real food, honest, hearty, warm. The kind of food that sticks to your ribs and quiets your thoughts for a while. Inside the mess hall, the mood shifted. The earlier mocking tone began to fade, replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. The men ate slowly now, their earlier jokes dissolving in the steam that filled the air. Some still held onto their pride, chewing with an exaggerated disinterest. But the edges of their arrogance were softening. A few even leaned forward, dipping their bread into the broth to soak up every drop. It was strange how something as simple as a bowl of stew could undo so much tension. Just minutes earlier, this same room had been filled with laughter and scorn. Now it felt almost peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't need to be spoken. Outside, the guards noticed the change. One leaned against the doorway, watching silently. He'd seen the same pattern many times before. The Germans always mocked the food at first. Then they'd eat it. Then they'd ask for more. It had become almost predictable. But even knowing that, it never stopped feeling profound. The moment when pride cracked and humanity showed through. Inside, one of the older prisoners, a former officer, set down his spoon and looked at the bowl in front of him. His face was thin, his cheeks hollowed from months of rationing. He had served in North Africa, where rations had been little more than dry bread and thin soup, where men starved under the sun and called it duty. The stew before him was nothing like that. It was rich, comforting, generous. He hated how much he liked it. He wanted to stay angry, to keep his distance from the Americans, but the food made it difficult. It reminded him too much of home, of his wife's Sunday meals, of warmth and laughter that now felt like they belonged to another lifetime. Across from him, a younger soldier spoke up quietly. "It tastes like something my mother used to make." The older man gave him a sharp look, but didn't scold him. Instead, he nodded slightly. "J.A.," he murmured, almost to himself. "It does." The American cooks moved between tables refilling water jugs, pretending not to notice the shift in mood. They didn't need to. They could feel it. The sharp tension that had filled the room was melting, replaced by something softer, almost fragile. For all their differences, the men on both sides of the counter were bound by the same small truth. Food was more than nourishment. It was memory. Each spoonful told a story. The sweetness of carrots whispered of harvests long past. The richness of beef spoke of Sunday dinners, of laughter that once echoed through warm kitchens. Even the salt, the simplest ingredient, tasted of the sea, of travel, of faraway places these men might never see again. As they ate, the Germans began to talk among themselves, not about the food, not directly, but about things they hadn't spoken of in months. One mentioned his hometown near Munich, another talked about the fields outside Dresden, another about the smell of fresh bread in the morning. It wasn't nostalgia exactly, but something close to it. The stew had loosened their tongues and their guard. In that moment, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a pause in time. The fences still stood, the guards still watched, but inside those walls, something invisible shifted. They were no longer the enemy, not entirely. They were men with memories, appetites and stories. The war, for a brief moment, existed somewhere far away. Not everyone gave in so easily. A few diehards still refused to eat, their bowls untouched in front of them. They sat stiff, backed eyes forward, determined not to enjoy anything their captors offered. To them, this was weakness, a betrayal of pride. But even they could not escape the smell, the soft murmur of satisfaction around them. Their resolve wavered, minute by minute, until even they lifted their spoons in quiet surrender. There was something deeply human about that silence, the kind of silence that comes not from discomfort, but from understanding, the kind that makes you realize how fragile the distance between enemies can be. As the meal went on, the cooks exchanged glances. One of them, a quiet man named Louis, chuckled under his breath. "Guess it ain't so bad after all," he said softly. His friend, cleaning the counter beside him, grinned. "They'll be back for seconds, always are." Back at the tables, the bowls were emptying fast. Some prisoners leaned forward, scraping the bottom with their spoons, determined not to waste a drop. Others looked embarrassed by their own enthusiasm. No one wanted to admit how much they'd enjoyed it. Yet, under the roughness of their faces, there was an undeniable expression of relief. Relief that for once, the food didn't taste like war. One soldier paused between bites, setting down his spoon. "Strange?" he said quietly to the man beside him. "When I first saw it, I thought it was something you feed to pigs. But it's good." His companion nodded, smiling faintly. "Better than what we fed ourselves the last month before capture." They both laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. Outside the mess hall, the air carried the smell of stew mixed with smoke from the campfires. A few guards leaned on their rifles, talking idly, watching as the last of the prisoners filed out, their postures more relaxed than when they'd entered. None of them said much, but their faces told the story. The defiance in their eyes was dimmer now, not gone but quieter, like embers cooling after a storm. Later that night, the conversations continued in whispers across the barracks. Men who once mocked the Americans now admitted that perhaps the food wasn't so barbaric after all. Someone joked that the U.S. cooks must have stolen their recipes from Bavaria. Laughter rippled softly through the bunks, not the cruel laughter from before, but something warmer. That stew had done more than fill their bellies. It had cracked something open inside them. A door they hadn't realized was still locked. It reminded them of what it meant to feel human even in captivity. In war, hatred is easy, pride is easy. What's harder is to feel something as simple as gratitude, to recognize decency in your enemy. But in that camp, on that quiet morning in 1944, it happened. Not through politics or speeches or negotiations, just through food. Through warmth and flavor and a moment of shared silence over steaming bowls. When lights went out that night, the camp settled into stillness. Somewhere in the dark, a prisoner whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for escape, but for peace. For another morning like this one. For another taste of something that reminded him, just for a little while, of home. When the last spoon scraped against a metal bowl, the sound echoed softly through the mess hall, mingling with the clatter of boots and then the low hum of voices. It was nearing noon, and sunlight slanted through the dusty windows, catching in the drifting steam that still rose from the great pots in the kitchen. The guards had expected complaints, sarcastic remarks, perhaps a few trays left untouched. What they got instead were murmurs of something else entirely, gratitude. At first it was subtle, a nod from one prisoner as he returned his tray, a polite, almost hesitant, "Danke." Then another, and another. The cooks looked up in quiet surprise, unsure if they'd heard correctly. These were the same men who had mocked the food hours ago, who had sneered at the stew as if it were an insult. Now they were asking, politely, humbly, for more. Sergeant Roy Peterson, the camp cook from Kansas, leaned on the counter, squinting toward the growing line. "What's this now?" he asked with a faint grin. His assistant, Private Lewis, laughed softly. "They're asking for seconds." "Seconds," Peterson repeated, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "The same fellas who called it pig feed." Lewis nodded, already reaching for the ladle. "Guess we changed their minds." "Guess so," Peterson said, though there was no triumph in his tone, just something quieter, something like understanding. He gestured for the men to bring their trays forward. "All right then, come on. There's plenty." The Germans stepped forward slowly, some still looking unsure if it was allowed. It felt almost shameful to ask. These were soldiers trained to show no weakness, to never beg, to never thank their captors for anything. But hunger and good food had a way of stripping away those illusions. One by one, they extended their trays, and the Americans filled them again. Thick, generous portions of stew splashed into dented metal bowls, the smell rising once more to fill the hall. The first man to take a second helping murmured, "It's very good." The words came out awkwardly, as though foreign on his tongue. The cook smiled faintly. "Glad you think so." The second man hesitated before speaking. "Better than what we had on the front." That made Peterson pause. He knew what the German fronts looked like, had heard the stories, seen the photos. Frozen mud, dead horses, starving soldiers. For a brief moment, the two men, on opposite sides of a brutal war, shared a look that said more than words could. The German nodded once in quiet respect and stepped aside. Soon, the line grew longer. There was no more laughter now, no more mockery. Just the soft sounds of spoons dipping, bowls being filled, and the faint murmur of "thank you" in a dozen accents and dialects. The guards standing nearby exchanged glances, some even smiling. This was something rare in a POW camp, something they didn't see every day. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with warmth and the faint hiss of simmering pots. The cooks moved efficiently, their sleeves rolled up, their faces damp with sweat. They'd cooked for hundreds of men before, soldiers and prisoners alike. But there was something different about today, something unspoken hung in the air, a quiet sense that this meal had bridged a distance wider than any battlefield. Outside, the camp stretched under a vast blue sky. The barbed wire fences glittered in the sun, and the watchtowers cast long shadows over the yard. But inside those fences, the world had softened, just a little. Grouped, he wondered if the Allied bombs had reached their neighborhood again. For the first time since his capture, he allowed himself a small, dangerous hope. That maybe when the war was over, there could still be decency left in the world. Elsewhere in the camp, two young soldiers whispered in the dark. "They don't hate us," one said quietly. The other shrugged. "Maybe they do, but not enough to let us starve." They both laughed softly, the kind of laugh that comes not from humor but relief. The next day, when the bell rang for lunch, the prisoners lined up again. Earlier this time, without prodding, they carried their trays with less arrogance, more patience. When the stew was served again, no one mocked it. No one joked. They just ate. And when they finished, several once more asked for seconds. The cooks obliged, as always saying little, but beneath their calm faces was something like pride, not the military kind, but the kind that comes from knowing you've done something right. Something that mattered. Over the following weeks, the stew became a quiet symbol in the camp. It was no longer just food. It was a reminder of something beyond war. The Germans began to help clean the mess hall afterward, unasked. Some even started teaching the American cooks German words for ingredients, laughing over the strange differences in pronunciation. Kartoffeln, one prisoner said, pointing to a pile of potatoes. Kartoffeln, Peterson repeated clumsily, making them all laugh. It was small, almost invisible but real, a slow, unspoken reconciliation in war. There are moments that history books never record. Moments that happen far from the front lines, in places like this, a camp kitchen, a wooden bench, a pot of stew. They don't make headlines or medals, but they matter just the same. They remind us that even when nations fight, people can still choose compassion over cruelty. Months later, when the war finally ended and the Germans began to be repatriated, some of those prisoners left notes behind. Scraps of paper written in careful, uncertain English. "Thank you for food," one said simply. Another, "We did not expect kindness, but you showed it. I will remember." Peterson found those notes years later, tucked inside an old recipe book he'd kept from the war. The pages were stained with grease and time, but when he read those of German soldiers sat on overturned crates or at wooden benches, eating slowly, savoring every spoonful. Some talked quietly, others simply closed their eyes, letting the taste take them somewhere far away. For many, it was the first time in months they'd eaten until they were full. The stew sat heavy and comforting in their stomachs. It was food that tasted of care, of effort, not rationing or desperation. In a way, it was the first real kindness they'd received since their surrender. Peterson stepped outside for a moment, wiping his hands on his apron. He watched the prisoners eating, his expression thoughtful. He had joined the army to serve, not to fight. His war wasn't in the trenches or skies. It was in kitchens like this behind the lines, where men discovered that feeding an enemy could be its own quiet act of victory. Not one of dominance, but of decency. "Funny thing," he said to Lewis, who had followed him out. "You feed a man, and suddenly he stops being the enemy for a while." Lewis nodded. "Yeah. Guess a good meal can do that." A few prisoners caught their gaze and, without words, raised their spoons slightly in acknowledgement. Peterson nodded back, tipping his cap. Later that afternoon, word spread through the camp. The Americans gave seconds. It wasn't just about food. It was about what it meant. To men who'd lived on stale bread, thin soup and suspicion, it felt almost impossible that the enemy would offer more than required. That they would serve not just to feed, but to comfort. By evening, the story reached even those who hadn't been at lunch. In the barracks, men spoke of it in quiet tones, as though discussing something sacred. One said the Americans must be trying to earn favor. Another argued they were simply following orders, but most, deep down, understood it differently. It wasn't politics. It wasn't strategy. It was humanity, pure and stubborn, refusing to die even in war. That night, as the lamps burned low, one of the older prisoners, a former sergeant from the Eastern Front, sat on his bunk thinking. He had seen too much of war's ugliness to believe in miracles. But something about the stew, about the second helping, about the way the Americans treated them like men instead of animals, stayed with him. It wasn't just food that filled his stomach. It was a small, fragile piece of dignity. He thought about his family back in Stuttgart, his wife and young daughter. He wondered if they were eating tonight. Words again, he smiled softly. In all his years of service, that day in the camp kitchen was the one he never forgot. The day a bowl of stew turned enemies into men, if only for an afternoon. The war had taken so much, but not everything. It hadn't taken kindness. It hadn't taken the quiet, stubborn belief that humanity could still exist in the unlikeliest places, like a wooden mess hall filled with laughter and the smell of stew. And though the world moved on, the story lingered. The memory of that day, of German soldiers who mocked a meal, then asked for seconds, became a small legend among the cooks. They told it to new recruits, to their children, to anyone who doubted that small acts could matter. Because in that camp, surrounded by fences and shadows, something extraordinary had happened. A simple American meal had done what politics could not. It had made enemies share a table, not in hatred, but in humility.